Most people think they'd recognize a billionaire if they saw one. They're wrong. On a cold Tuesday morning in Cleveland, Ohio, a man who could buy the entire city sat outside a grocery store, dressed like he'd lost everything. Torn jacket, weathered boots, paper cup for spare change. No one looked twice, except her. She didn't stop because she knew who he was. She stopped because she saw someone shivering. Someone alone. Someone who looked like they'd been forgotten by the world. When she handed him a cup of coffee and a breakfast sandwich, he looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much, and he asked her a question that made her heart stop. If you had to choose, what matters more, marrying for love or marrying for security? She laughed nervously, thinking he was just making conversation, until she realized he wasn't joking. He was testing her. What she didn't know was that this billionaire wasn't looking for charity. He was looking for a wife, not for himself, for his son. A son she'd never met. A son who had no idea his father was shopping for his future bride on the streets of Cleveland. And her answer to that one question had just made her a candidate. The test had begun, and she had no idea she was taking it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Richard Callaway, and at 72 years old, he'd built an empire worth over $3 billion. Real estate, technology, private equity. His wealth could solve problems most people couldn't imagine having. But it couldn't solve the one problem that kept him awake at night. His son was alone. Daniel Callaway was 36 years old, brilliant, successful, and completely isolated in a world that only saw his bank account. Every woman Daniel dated seemed to have an agenda. Every relationship felt transactional. Every smile felt rehearsed. Richard had watched his son go through a parade of women over the past decade, each one more calculating than the last. Women who researched his net worth before the first date. Women who suggested expensive restaurants and hinted at jewelry. Women who performed affection with the skill of actresses auditioning for a role. 3 months ago, Richard had found Daniel alone in his penthouse on a Saturday night, staring at nothing, and the emptiness in his son's eyes had terrified him. "I don't think anyone actually sees me anymore, Dad," Daniel had said. "I'm just a walking trust fund to most people. I can't tell who's real and who's performing." That conversation had haunted Richard for weeks. Richard knew the problem. Their world, the world of extreme wealth, was toxic for genuine relationships. Everyone Daniel met already knew who he was, what he had, what access to him could provide. There was no way to separate authentic interest from calculated strategy. No way to know if someone loved Daniel or loved what Daniel represented. So Richard made a decision that would have horrified his late wife Margaret if she'd been alive to witness it. He would find Daniel a wife. Not from their social circle. Not from the world of wealth and privilege where everyone performed and calculated. But from the real world. From normal people who had no idea the Callaway name existed. People who would show their true character because they thought no one important was watching. Richard spent weeks designing his plan. He would disguise himself as homeless and position himself in middle-class neighborhoods around Cleveland. He'd observe how people treated him when they thought he had nothing. And when he found someone genuinely kind, genuinely compassionate, someone who treated him with dignity despite his apparent circumstances, he'd investigate them thoroughly. And if they passed every test, if they were single, morally sound, psychologically healthy, and genuinely good, he'd find a way to introduce them to Daniel. Naturally, organically, in a way that would allow genuine connection to develop. Daniel would never know the meeting was orchestrated. The woman would never know she'd been selected. They'd fall in love thinking it was fate, when really it was Richard playing matchmaker with the precision he usually reserved for billion-dollar deals. It wasn't manipulation, Richard told himself. It was strategy. It was using his resources to solve an impossible problem. It was making sure his son didn't end up alone and bitter like Richard had been since Margaret died 8 years ago. It was love expressed through control. Richard spent 2 weeks preparing his disguise. Thrift store clothes that hung loose on his frame. A jacket that smelled like cigarettes and regret. He let his beard grow wild and gray. He practiced the posture of defeat. Shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, the physical language of someone who'd been beaten down by life. He studied homelessness the way he'd once studied market trends, learning the details that would make his performance convincing. On a cold Tuesday in October, Richard took his position outside Morrison's Market on the east side of Cleveland. Middle-class neighborhood, good schools, the kind of place where normal people lived normal lives. He sat on the concrete with his paper cup and a cardboard sign that said, "Anything helps. God bless." And he waited. The first 2 hours were humbling in ways Richard hadn't anticipated. People walked past him like he was furniture. Some actively avoided eye contact, changing their path to give him wide berth. A few dropped coins in his cup without looking at him, the change clattering like judgment. One man told him to get a job. A woman pulled her child closer as they passed, whispering warnings Richard could imagine even if he couldn't hear them. He'd known intellectually that homeless people were invisible to most of society, but experiencing it was different. By the third hour, Richard was questioning whether this plan would work. Maybe genuine kindness was too rare. Maybe he'd have to try different locations, different demographics. Maybe this entire approach was flawed. Then she appeared. She looked to be in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore scrubs under a winter coat, medical professional of some kind, and she walked with the purposeful stride of someone with somewhere to be. Richard watched her approach the store entrance, certain she'd walk past like everyone else. But she didn't. She stopped about 15 feet away, and she looked at him, really looked at him. Not the quick threat assessment glance most people did. Something longer, more considered, like she was actually seeing a person instead of a problem. Then she turned and walked into the store. Richard felt disappointment settle over him. For a moment he'd thought this one might be different. But no, she'd looked and kept walking. 5 minutes later, she emerged carrying a paper bag, and she walked directly toward him. She crouched down so they were at eye level, a gesture that surprised Richard more than anything else that day. Most people who helped the homeless did so from a standing position, maintaining physical and psychological distance. But this woman made herself vulnerable, putting herself on his level. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was warm without being condescending. "I'm Sarah. I noticed you sitting out here and thought you might be hungry." She handed him the bag. Inside was a large coffee, 2 breakfast sandwiches, a banana, and several hand warmers. "The coffee's black because I didn't know how you'd take it," Sarah continued. "But there's cream and sugar in the bag. And these hand warmers, you just shake them and they heat up. They last about 8 hours. It's supposed to get colder this afternoon." Richard stared at the bag, genuinely moved despite this being part of his plan. This wasn't spare change thrown without eye contact. This was thought. This was someone who'd considered what he might actually need. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice rough. "This is very kind." Sarah smiled. "You're welcome. Are you okay? Do you have somewhere to go when it gets really cold?" Richard shook his head, staying in character. "I'll figure something out. Always do." Sarah's expression showed genuine concern. "There's a shelter about 6 blocks from here, on Euclid Avenue. St. Michael's. They have beds and hot meals. If you need help getting there—" "I know it," Richard interrupted gently. "Thank you. Really. He held up the bag. "This is more than most people do." Sarah stood up, brushing off her knees. "Everyone deserves to eat. And to be seen." She paused, then added something that struck Richard deeply. "My mom used to work 3 jobs when I was growing up. And people treated her like she was invisible because she was poor, like poverty made her less human. I swore I'd never treat people that way." Richard felt something shift in his assessment. This woman wasn't just kind. She had a moral framework built from personal experience. She understood marginalization from the inside. "Your mother raised you well," Richard said quietly. Sarah's smile was sad. "She did her best. Take care of yourself. Okay?" She started to walk away, and Richard knew he had to push further. If this woman was going to be considered as a potential match for Daniel, He needed to understand not just her kindness but her values, her character, her understanding of what actually mattered. "Can I ask you something?" Richard called out. Sarah turned back. "Of course." Richard gestured for her to come closer. She did, crouching down again without hesitation. This detail mattered to Richard. She protected his dignity even in small ways. "You're young," Richard said. "Clearly educated. Got your life together." He gestured at her scrubs. "You work in medicine?" Sarah nodded. "I'm a nurse. Cardiac unit at Metro Hospital." Richard filed this information away. "Nurse. Cardiac unit. Stable career. Helping profession. So you're smart. Capable. Probably independent." He paused. "Can I ask you a personal question?" "You can tell me no." Sarah's expression became slightly guarded. "You can ask. I might not answer." Richard respected that boundary. "Fair enough. Here's my question. If you had to choose, what matters more in a husband? Marrying for love or marrying for security?" Sarah's face changed. Surprise, then something that looked like pain, then careful consideration. She didn't answer immediately, and Richard appreciated that. Thoughtless answers revealed nothing. It was the people who actually weighed their words who showed you who they really were. "That's a very specific question," Sarah finally said. "And it sounds like something someone asks when they've been hurt, when they've seen relationships fail because people chose wrong." She paused. "Why are you asking me this?" Richard shrugged, maintaining his cover. "Out here you see a lot. You hear a lot. Young women walking by talking about their boyfriends. Some sound like they're in love. Some sound like they're calculating their next financial move. Makes you think about what matters." Sarah seemed to accept this explanation. "Okay," Sarah said slowly. "I'll answer. But first, I think your question sets up a false choice. Like you can't have both love and security. Like they're opposites." She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "My father left when I was 10. Just walked out one day and never came back. My mom had married him because he had a stable job, a house, a plan for the future. She thought that was being smart, choosing security over romance." Sarah's expression darkened with old pain. "But my dad didn't love her. Not really. He loved the idea of her, the pretty wife who made him look successful, who took care of the house and raised his kid. And when things got hard, when money got tight and the fantasy cracked, he left. Just abandoned us." Richard listened carefully, hearing not just her words, but what they revealed about her worldview. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That must have been difficult." Sarah nodded. "It was. But it taught me something important. Security without love isn't security at all. It's just a comfortable cage until someone decides to leave. And then you're left with nothing. Not love, not security, just wreckage." She met Richard's eyes directly. "So to answer your question, love matters more. Real love. Not infatuation or attraction or convenience, but real love where someone actually sees you and chooses you. That's the only real security that exists. Everything else is just an illusion that can disappear overnight." Richard felt something click into place. This woman had just articulated the exact philosophy Margaret used to live by. That real security came from connection, not circumstances. That the only thing that lasted was genuine love. "That's a good answer," Richard said softly. "I hope you find that kind of love." Sarah smiled. "Me too. I hope you find some security out here. Please stay warm. Okay?" She glanced at her watch. "I have to get to work, but I'm at Morrison's a few times a week, usually Tuesday and Thursday mornings. If I see you again, I'll check in." Richard nodded, filing away this information. Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Predictable schedule. She was offering continued care, not just a one-time gesture. Sarah walked toward her car, and Richard watched her go, his mind already working. He'd found her. After just one morning, he'd found exactly the kind of person he'd been looking for. Genuinely kind, thoughtful, morally grounded. Someone who understood that love mattered more than money. Someone who'd been shaped by hardship but hadn't let it make her bitter. Someone who saw people really saw them regardless of their circumstances. Someone perfect for Daniel. Now came the next phase. Richard needed to know everything about her. Not just surface details, but deep information. Was she truly single? What was her psychological profile? Her relationship history? Her values in other contexts? Did this kindness extend beyond homeless strangers? Or was it performative charity that disappeared when cameras weren't rolling? Richard had resources most people couldn't imagine. By that evening, he had a preliminary report. Sarah Mitchell, 29 years old, cardiac nurse at Metro General Hospital for the past 4 years. Grew up in Cleveland, put herself through nursing school at Cleveland State University while working 2 part-time jobs. Single, never married. No serious relationships in the past 3 years according to social media, which she barely used. She lived in a modest apartment in Lakewood, drove an 8-year-old Honda Civic, and spent her free time volunteering at a youth center in her old neighborhood teaching kids basic health and wellness. Richard read the report 3 times, looking for red flags. There were none. Every piece of information confirmed his initial assessment. This was a woman of substance. Someone who'd built a meaningful life without wealth or privilege. Someone who gave more than she took. Someone who saw people. Perfect for Daniel. But surface information wasn't enough. Richard needed to see her in other contexts. Needed to verify that the kindness she'd shown him wasn't an isolated incident, but a consistent pattern. So over the next 2 weeks, Richard became Sarah Mitchell's shadow. Not in a creepy, stalking way, he told himself, but in a strategic way. He positioned himself at the youth center where she volunteered, disguised as a different homeless man, watching how she interacted with the teenagers. She was patient, funny, genuinely engaged. She treated the kids with respect, never talking down to them, always finding ways to make health education interesting instead of preachy. Richard watched her at the hospital during a shift change, this time disguised as an elderly patient's family member. He saw how she talked to patients, taking time to explain procedures, holding hands during scary moments, advocating for a confused elderly woman who couldn't communicate her pain. He watched her at the grocery store, at a coffee shop, at the library. In every context, Sarah was consistent. Kind without being performative. Present without being intrusive. Helpful without being condescending. She held doors for people. She picked up trash. She let people with fewer items go ahead of her in line. Small things that revealed character. After 2 weeks of observation, Richard was certain. Sarah Mitchell was exactly what Daniel needed. Someone genuine. Someone kind. Someone who would love Daniel for who he was, not what he had. Because Sarah didn't even know what he had. Didn't know the Calloway name existed. Would have no preconceptions or calculations when she met Daniel. Now came the hard part. How do you introduce 2 people who have no natural reason to meet? How do you create a chance encounter that feels organic, not orchestrated? How do you play Cupid without anyone knowing there's an archer? Richard spent days considering scenarios. A charity event felt too obvious. A coffee shop accident felt too staged. He needed something that would bring them together naturally, in a context where both could be themselves. Where Sarah's genuine character would shine through and Daniel would see what Richard had seen. The answer came from Daniel himself. During their weekly dinner, one of the few times Daniel left his penthouse these days, his son mentioned something that gave Richard the opening he needed. "I've been thinking about doing something different," Daniel said, picking at his food with little appetite. "Something more meaningful than just moving money around. Maybe volunteering somewhere. Actually helping people instead of just funding programs I never see." Richard's mind raced. "What kind of volunteering?" Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. Something hands-on. Something real. I'm tired of writing checks and never seeing where the money goes or whether it actually helps." Richard saw his opportunity. What about health education? There are programs that bring medical professionals together with community volunteers to teach wellness in underserved neighborhoods. Hands-on. Direct impact. Real people. Daniel looked interested for the first time in months. "That sounds good. How would I find something like that?" Richard kept his expression neutral. "Let me look into it. I'll see what programs exist and send you some options." After dinner, Richard went home and designed exactly what he'd described. Through a series of carefully structured donations and strategic conversations with nonprofit directors, Richard created a community health education program. It was legitimate, he made sure of that, funding it properly and ensuring it would actually help people. But he also made sure it would accomplish his primary goal. The program would be run through Metro General Hospital. It would need cardiac nurses to teach CPR and healthy living. And it would recruit volunteers from local businesses to help run workshops in underserved neighborhoods. Within 3 weeks, the program existed. Metro General reached out to their cardiac nurses asking for volunteers. Sarah, with her existing volunteer work at the youth center, was a natural fit. She signed up immediately. Through his assistant, who had no idea she was being used as a pawn, Richard made sure Daniel heard about the program. Made sure it was presented as a great opportunity for meaningful volunteer work. Made sure it sounded exactly like what Daniel had said he wanted. Daniel signed up. The first meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning at the youth center where Sarah already volunteered. Richard had orchestrated every detail. The program coordinator, who had no idea Richard was pulling strings, paired volunteers with medical professionals based on compatible schedules and complementary skills. Sarah Mitchell was paired with Daniel Calloway. They'd spend the next 6 weeks working together every Saturday, teaching teenagers about health and wellness. 6 weeks for Daniel to see Sarah's genuine kindness. 6 weeks for Sarah to see Daniel as just a man, not a billionaire. 6 weeks for them to connect without the contamination of knowing about money. It was perfect. It was manipulation. It was both. And Richard told himself it was justified because it would make his son happy. Because the end result, Daniel finding genuine love, would make the dishonest means worthwhile. On the Friday night before the first meeting, Richard sat in his study with a glass of scotch, feeling triumph and guilt in equal measure. Tomorrow, Daniel would meet Sarah. Neither of them would know the meeting was orchestrated. Neither would know Richard had spent weeks selecting her, observing her, designing this entire scenario. They'd think it was chance, coincidence, maybe even fate. They'd never know it was Richard playing God with their lives. Margaret's voice echoed in Richard's head, the way it often did when he was doing something she would have questioned. Control isn't love, Richard. And manipulation, even with good intentions, is still manipulation. People deserve autonomy, even when we think we know better. Richard pushed the voice away. This was different. He wasn't controlling Daniel's choice. He was just creating the opportunity for Daniel to meet someone genuinely good. What happened after that would be up to them. He was helping, not manipulating. Orchestrating, not controlling. He kept telling himself that. Kept building the justifications. Kept ignoring the small voice that whispered he was crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. Tomorrow, Daniel would meet the woman Richard had chosen for him. And neither of them would ever know. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Richard positioned himself across the street from the youth center in his car, unable to resist watching despite knowing he should stay away. He watched Daniel arrive, looking uncomfortable in jeans and a casual sweater instead of his usual expensive suit. Watched him walk into the building with his shoulders tight, clearly nervous about this new environment. 10 minutes later, Sarah arrived, wearing jeans and a cheerful sweater, carrying a bag of supplies. She walked in with the easy confidence of someone in familiar territory. Richard sat in his car for 3 hours, imagining what was happening inside. Were they talking? Connecting? Was Daniel seeing what Richard had seen? Sarah's genuine kindness? Her ability to connect with people, her moral clarity? Was Sarah seeing Daniel as just a man, uncontaminated by knowledge of his wealth? When people finally started emerging from the youth center, Richard watched carefully. Daniel and Sarah walked out together, deep in conversation. Sarah was gesturing animatedly, telling some story that made Daniel laugh. Actual laughter, something Richard hadn't seen from his son in months. They stood in the parking lot for another 20 minutes, clearly not wanting the conversation to end. Richard felt satisfaction settle over him like a blanket. It was working. They were connecting. Everything he'd planned was unfolding perfectly. Finally, they exchanged phone numbers. Richard could see them typing into their phones and went to their separate cars. But both of them sat in their cars for a moment before starting the engines, clearly processing whatever had just happened. Richard started his own car and drove away before Daniel could spot him. He went home and waited, wondering if Daniel would call. 2 hours later, his phone rang. "Dad." Daniel's voice was different, lighter. "I did that volunteer thing today, the health education program." Richard kept his voice neutral. "How was it?" "Dad, it was amazing. We worked with these teenagers, teaching them CPR and healthy living, and they were so engaged. And my partner." Daniel's voice grew more animated. "Sarah. She's this nurse, and she was incredible with the kids. Patient and funny and just real. We talked for like 2 hours after the program ended. She's not like anyone I usually meet." Richard felt triumph and guilt in equal measure. "She sounds wonderful. Are you going to see her again?" "Next Saturday, for the program." "But actually," Daniel paused. "I asked if she'd want to grab coffee sometime this week, and she said yes." "Dad, I haven't been this excited about meeting someone in years." Richard closed his eyes. "That's great, son. Really great." After they hung up, Richard sat in his study for a long time. His plan had worked. Daniel and Sarah had connected. The relationship he'd orchestrated was beginning exactly as he'd designed it. But the guilt was stronger than he'd expected. Because Daniel thought this was organic. Thought he'd met someone by chance, by luck, by fate. Had no idea his father had spent weeks selecting this woman. Observing her, manufacturing this entire scenario. Sarah thought the same. Thought she'd met a nice man through volunteer work. Had no idea she'd been chosen, tested, investigated, and positioned like a chess piece on Richard's board. Neither of them had consented to this. Neither had agency in how their story began. Richard had stolen that from them, and they didn't even know it. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and Sarah's relationship developed exactly as Richard had hoped. They had coffee after the volunteer session, then dinner, then long walks through the city where they talked about everything. Childhoods, dreams, fears, philosophy. Daniel called Richard almost daily with updates, his voice filled with a joy Richard hadn't heard in years. "She's different, Dad. She doesn't care about money. She didn't even know who the Calloway family was when I told her my last name. She just sees me." Richard listened to his son's happiness and felt pride and shame in equal measure. Pride because he'd made this happen. Shame because he'd made this happen through deception. One evening, 6 weeks into their relationship, Daniel invited Richard to dinner at his penthouse. "I want you to meet someone," Daniel said on the phone. "Someone really important to me." Richard's heart raced. This was it. The moment when he'd have to pretend to meet Sarah for the first time. When he'd have to act surprised, to evaluate her for Daniel's benefit, to perform not knowing her when he probably knew more about her than she knew about herself. When Sarah walked into Daniel's penthouse that evening, Richard felt the full weight of his deception. She smiled at him with genuine warmth, extending her hand. "Mr. Calloway, it's so nice to meet you. Daniel's told me so much about you." Richard shook her hand, searching her face for any sign of recognition. Did she remember the homeless man outside Morrison's market? Did she see through his expensive suit to the beggar she'd shown kindness to? But Sarah's expression showed nothing except polite nervousness. The way anyone would feel meeting their new boyfriend's wealthy father for the first time. She didn't recognize him. Why would she? The transformation was complete. And Sarah had probably shown kindness to dozens of homeless people over the years. One face among many. Richard played his role perfectly. The evaluating father. Asking questions. Assessing her character. Pretending to discover what he already knew. And Sarah handled it beautifully. She was honest about her background, her modest upbringing, her work. She didn't try to impress him with false sophistication. She was just herself. After dinner, when Daniel stepped away to take a phone call, Sarah turned to Richard with unexpected directness. "I can tell you're evaluating me," she said quietly. "That's okay. Any parent would want to make sure their child is with someone who cares about them for the right reasons. Richard felt caught off guard by her perception. I just want to make sure Daniel's happy. Sarah nodded. So do I. And I want you to know. I didn't know who the Calloway family was when I met Daniel. Didn't know about the money or the business or any of it. I met a man who volunteers with teenagers and makes me laugh and listens when I talk about my patients. That's who I fell for. She met Richard's eyes. I'm not after his money, Mr. Calloway. I have my own life, my own career. I'm happy with what I have. I just want to be with someone who sees me for who I am. And Daniel does. And I see him the same way. Richard felt his throat tighten. This woman, this kind, genuine, morally grounded woman, was explaining herself to him, defending her character, when she had no idea Richard had already vetted her more thoroughly than any background check. Had chosen her specifically for these exact qualities. Had engineered this entire relationship. I believe you, Richard said. And he did. Because he'd seen her character long before this conversation. But Sarah didn't know that. Didn't know Richard had tested her when she thought no one important was watching. Didn't know she'd been selected before she ever met Daniel. Didn't know their entire love story was built on Richard's manipulation. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, I'm still here. Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Over the following months, Daniel and Sarah's relationship deepened in ways that exceeded even Richard's careful planning. They fell in love. Real love. The kind Richard had hoped for but couldn't have guaranteed. Daniel was happier than Richard had ever seen him. He smiled more, laughed more, started coming out of the isolated shell he'd built around himself. He brought Sarah to family events, introduced her to his friends, talked about her constantly with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found something precious. Sarah seemed equally transformed. She softened Daniel's hard edges, challenged him when he got too focused on work, introduced him to her world, her friends, her volunteering, her modest but meaningful life. They were good together, balanced, real. Richard watched it all unfold with satisfaction and growing dread. Satisfaction because his plan had worked perfectly. Dread because the lie at the foundation of their relationship grew heavier every day. They thought they'd met by chance. Thought their connection was organic. Thought the universe had brought them together through coincidence and timing. They had no idea Richard had manufactured every moment of their meeting. Had orchestrated their entire relationship from his shadowy position offstage. 10 months after they first met, Daniel called Richard with news that made Richard's heart soar and sink simultaneously. I'm going to propose, Daniel said, his voice full of joy. I bought a ring. I'm taking her to the botanical gardens this weekend. It's where we had one of our first dates, and I'm going to ask her to marry me. Richard felt tears prick his eyes. She's going to say yes, and you two are going to be so happy together. I know, Daniel said, and Richard could hear the smile in his voice. Dad, I never thought I'd find this. Someone who actually loves me. Not my money or my name or what I can give her. Just me. Thank you for pushing me to do that volunteer program. If you hadn't, I never would have met her. Richard felt the guilt crash over him like a wave. I'm happy for you, son. Truly. After hanging up, Richard sat in his study staring at nothing. His plan had worked. Perfectly. Beyond his best-case scenario. Daniel had found genuine love with a genuinely good woman who saw him for who he actually was. They were going to get married. Build a life together. Be happy. Everything Richard had wanted. But it was all built on a lie. A lie that would eventually come out. Maybe not today. Maybe not this year. But someday. Lies always come out. And when this one did, it would devastate them both. Richard made a decision. He couldn't let Daniel propose, let them get engaged, let them start planning a wedding, all while carrying this secret. He had to tell them the truth. Before the proposal. Before they built their entire lives on a foundation contaminated by his manipulation. It was the right thing to do. The only thing to do. Even if it cost him everything. Even if they hated him. Even if it destroyed the happiness he'd worked so hard to create. Margaret's voice in his head was clear now. Truth, Richard. Always truth. No matter the cost. Richard picked up his phone and called Sarah directly. Not Daniel. Sarah deserved to hear this first. She was the one who'd been observed and selected and positioned without her knowledge. Sarah, it's Richard Calloway. Do you have time to talk? In person. Soon. There's something I need to tell you before Daniel proposes. Sarah's voice was confused. Before he proposes? How do you know he's going to? Please, Richard interrupted. Trust me. This is important. Can you come to my house tomorrow? Alone. Before Daniel asks you. There was a long pause. You're scaring me, Mr. Calloway. I know. I'm sorry. But I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you months ago. Something that will change how you see everything. Another pause. Then, quietly, okay, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Richard hung up and sat in the silence of his study, knowing that in less than 24 hours, he was going to destroy everything he'd built. But it was the right thing to do. The only thing to do. He just hoped Sarah and Daniel would eventually understand. Eventually forgive. Eventually be able to salvage something real from the manipulated beginning he'd created. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Richard's estate exactly at 10. She looked nervous, dressed in jeans and a sweater, clearly having taken the morning off work for this mysterious meeting. Richard led her into his study and gestured to the couch. Thank you for coming. Would you like coffee? Water? Sarah shook her head. I just want to know what's going on. You said something about Daniel proposing, and something you need to tell me. Mr. Calloway, you're making me nervous. Richard sat across from her, his hands shaking slightly. I'm about to tell you something that's going to make you question everything about your relationship with Daniel. And I want you to know first that what you and Daniel have, the love between you, that's real. Your feelings are real. His feelings are real. But how you met? He paused, forcing himself to continue. How you met wasn't chance. It was me. Sarah's expression shifted from nervous to confused. What do you mean it was you? Richard took a deep breath and told her everything. The homeless disguise, the test, watching her at Morrison's market, following her for 2 weeks, observing her at the hospital, the youth center, everywhere, creating the volunteer program specifically to bring her and Daniel together, orchestrating their first meeting, manufacturing their entire relationship. He watched Sarah's face change as he spoke. Confusion to shock to disbelief to dawning horror. You're telling me, Sarah said slowly, her voice shaking, that you picked me before Daniel ever met me? That you tested me by pretending to be homeless? That you stalked me for weeks? That you created an entire program just to force Daniel and me together? Richard nodded. Yes, I thought I was helping. I thought I was protecting Daniel from predatory women. I thought if I found someone genuinely good and brought you together naturally. Naturally? Sarah's voice rose. You call this natural? You manipulated every aspect of our meeting. Daniel and I didn't meet by chance. We met because you decided I was good enough for your son and positioned us like chess pieces. She stood up, pacing, her hands shaking. Do you understand what you've done? You've contaminated my entire relationship. Every memory I have of meeting Daniel, of falling in love with him, all of it is tainted now. Because it wasn't real. It wasn't organic. It was you pulling strings behind a curtain. Tears were streaming down her face now. I thought Daniel and I found each other. I thought what we had was special, was fate, was this beautiful accident. But it wasn't an accident at all. It was you playing God with our lives. Richard felt tears on his own face. I'm so sorry. You're right. About all of it. What I did was wrong. Unforgivably wrong. But I'm telling you now because I can't let you build your life with Daniel on this lie. You deserve to know the truth before you say yes to his proposal. Sarah laughed bitterly. How do you know he's going to propose? Oh wait. Did you orchestrate that too? Did you plant the idea in his head? Script the proposal? No, Richard said firmly. Everything after your first meeting, that was all you and Daniel. I didn't interfere beyond creating that initial opportunity. His feelings are genuine. Your relationship is genuine. Just the beginning was manipulated, Sarah finished. The beginning was manipulated. And the beginning matters, Richard. It's the foundation everything else is built on. And you've just told me our foundation is a lie. She grabbed her purse, moving toward the door. Does Daniel know? Richard shook his head. Not yet. I'm telling you first because you deserve to know before him. You were the one I tested and observed and selected. You deserved to hear it from me before anyone else. Sarah stopped at the door. I need to think. I need to process this. I don't know what I'm going to tell Daniel. I don't even know if I can look at him without seeing your manipulation behind every moment we've shared. She turned back, and the pain in her eyes gutted Richard. You know what the worst part is? You're right that my feelings are real. I do love Daniel. But now I'll never know if I would have loved him if we'd met differently. If I would have felt the same way if our meeting hadn't been engineered by you. You've stolen my ability to trust my own feelings. Sarah's voice broke. I thought I was choosing him. I thought I had agency in my own love story. But I was just performing in a play you wrote. And I didn't even know I was on stage. Richard stood up, wanting to comfort her but knowing he had no right. Sarah, please. Your love is yours. I didn't create that. I couldn't create that. I just created the opportunity for you to meet. Everything else, every conversation, every date, every moment of connection. That was you too. That was real. Sarah wiped her eyes angrily. You don't get to tell me what's real. You don't get to manipulate my entire life and then define what parts of it count as genuine. She opened the door. I need to talk to Daniel. He deserves to know what his father did. What you stole from both of us. She paused. And then I need to figure out if I can marry someone when the entire foundation of our relationship is built on a lie. Even if that lie came from you and not from him. She left, and Richard stood in his empty study listening to her car drive away. He'd done the right thing by telling her. He knew that, but doing the right thing didn't erase the wrong thing he'd done in the first place. And now he'd destroyed the happiness he'd worked so hard to create. 2 hours later, his phone exploded with calls from Daniel. Richard didn't answer. Let Sarah tell him. Let Daniel hear it from her. Let them process together what Richard had done to them. Finally, a text came through. Just 3 words. How could you? Richard stared at those words for a long time. Then he typed back, I'm sorry. I thought I was helping. I was wrong. I'll understand if you never want to see me again. The response came immediately. We're coming over. Both of us. You're going to explain this. All of it. An hour later, Daniel and Sarah arrived at Richard's estate. Daniel's face was a mixture of fury and devastation. Sarah looked like she'd been crying for hours. They sat on the couch together, holding hands, presenting a united front. Richard sat across from them, prepared to face whatever came. Explain, Daniel said, his voice cold. Explain how you thought stalking someone, testing them without their knowledge, and manipulating your own son's life was helping. Richard took a deep breath and told them everything again. The full story. His fears for Daniel. The plan to find someone genuine. The homeless disguise. Following Sarah. Creating the volunteer program. Orchestrating their meeting. He left nothing out. When he finished, Daniel just stared at him. You treated us like we were incapable of making our own decisions. Like we were children who needed you to manage our lives. Daniel's voice was shaking with anger. Do you have any idea how this makes me feel? Every moment I thought I was choosing my own life, you were pulling strings. Every time I felt lucky to have found Sarah, it wasn't luck. It was you. He stood up, pacing. And Sarah, God, Sarah. You tested her like she was applying for a job. You observed her like she was a specimen. You investigated her life without her consent. You treated her like an acquisition to be vetted instead of a person with her own autonomy. Daniel turned to face Richard. You know what Mom used to say? That the measure of love isn't what you do for people, but what you allow them to do for themselves. That real love requires trusting people to make their own choices, even when those choices scare you. Tears were running down Daniel's face now. You didn't love me enough to trust me. You didn't respect me enough to let me find my own happiness. You decided you knew better and manipulated every aspect of my life. That's not love, Dad. That's control disguised as protection. Sarah spoke for the first time since arriving. I've been sitting here for the past 2 hours trying to figure out if I can marry Daniel knowing our entire story is contaminated by your manipulation. Her voice was quiet but steady. And the answer is I don't know. I love him. I know that's real. But I also know that I'll never be able to look at our wedding photos or tell our children how we met without remembering that none of it was real. That I was selected and positioned and tested like a product. She looked at Richard with something that might have been pity. You thought you were being so clever, so strategic. But what you actually did was steal something precious from us. You stole our story. You stole our ability to believe in fate or chance or the beautiful accidents that bring people together. Sarah's voice grew stronger. And you stole my dignity. You turned my kindness into a test I didn't consent to take. You made me perform for an audience I didn't know existed. You evaluated me based on criteria I never agreed to. You decided I was good enough for your son without ever asking if your son was good enough for me. Richard felt the full weight of what he'd done. You're right. I'm so deeply sorry. To both of you. I thought I was protecting Daniel, but I was really just protecting myself. Protecting myself from feeling powerless. From admitting that I can't control everything. From trusting that good things can happen without my intervention. He looked at his son. Daniel, you told me months ago that you just wanted someone who saw you, and I found that for you. But in doing so, I took away your agency to find it yourself. I stole your story, and I'm sorry. I'm so profoundly sorry. Daniel sat back down next to Sarah. I need time. We need time. Time to figure out if we can build something real from this manipulated beginning. Time to decide if we can forgive you. Time to understand if our relationship can survive knowing it was built on your lies. He stood up. Don't contact us. Don't send gifts or apologies or explanations. Just give us space. If we decide we can move forward with each other or with you, we'll let you know. But right now, I can't even look at you. They left together, and Richard sat alone in his study with the wreckage of what he'd done. He'd found his son the perfect woman, had orchestrated the perfect relationship, had achieved exactly what he'd set out to do, and in doing so, he'd destroyed everything. Days turned into weeks with no word from Daniel or Sarah. Richard didn't violate their boundary by reaching out. He just waited, drowning in guilt and regret, wondering if he'd destroyed his relationship with his son forever. His therapist, when he finally worked up the courage to confess everything, was blunt. Richard, what you did was profoundly unethical. You violated both of their autonomy in fundamental ways. You treated them like problems to be solved instead of people to be trusted. She leaned forward. But here's the question you need to ask yourself. Why did you really do this? Was it truly about protecting Daniel? Or was it about maintaining control in a world that felt chaotic after your wife died? Richard sat with that question for days, and slowly, painfully, he realized the truth. He'd been so terrified of losing Daniel the way he'd lost Margaret. Not to death, but to distance, to bad choices, to a predatory relationship, that he tried to control every variable, to engineer a perfect outcome, to play God because feeling powerless was unbearable. But in trying to prevent loss, he'd created it. He'd lost Daniel's trust, lost Sarah's respect, lost the relationship with his son that had been the only meaningful connection in his life since Margaret died. For weeks after their confrontation, Richard received a phone call from Daniel. Sarah and I have been talking. A lot. We've been to therapy together, trying to figure out if we can move forward. Daniel's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. Can I come over? There's something we need to discuss. Richard agreed immediately. When Daniel arrived, he was alone. No, Sarah. Richard's heart sank. This was it. Daniel was coming to cut ties, to tell him their relationship was over, to deliver the consequences Richard knew he deserved. Daniel sat in the study, in the same spot where he'd sat during the confrontation. Sarah and I are still together, Daniel said without preamble. We're working through what you did, trying to separate our genuine feelings from the manipulated circumstances that brought us together. Relief flooded through Richard. I'm so glad. I'm not finished, Daniel interrupted. We're still together, but everything's changed. We'll never get back the innocence of thinking we found each other by chance. We'll never have the simple story other couples have. Every memory of our early relationship is tainted now by knowing you were pulling strings. Daniel's expression was pained. But we've decided that what we have is worth fighting for. That your manipulation, as horrible as it was, doesn't erase the genuine connection we've built. We love each other. That's real. And we're not going to let your actions destroy what's real. Richard felt tears welling up. Thank you. Thank you for not letting my mistakes ruin your happiness. Daniel held up his hand. I'm still not finished. Sarah and I are staying together. But you, he paused. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I want you in my life. You violated my trust in ways I'm not sure can be repaired. The words hit Richard like physical blows. I understand. Whatever you need. What I need, Daniel said, his voice hard, is for you to understand that actions have consequences. That you don't get to manipulate people's lives and then be surprised when they don't want you around anymore. He stood up. Sarah's been more forgiving than I have. She says you did a terrible thing but that you told us the truth before the proposal, which shows some integrity. She says people make mistakes and deserve chances to change. Daniel's expression softened slightly. I don't know if I'm as generous as she is, but she asked me to give you a chance. Not to forgive you immediately or pretend this didn't happen, but to leave the door open for the possibility that someday, if you prove you've actually changed, we might rebuild some kind of relationship. Richard felt a small spark of hope. I'll do anything. I'll prove I've changed. I'll spend the rest of my life earning back your trust. Daniel shook his head. That's exactly the problem, Dad. You're still trying to control the outcome. Still trying to determine what happens next. But this isn't about you proving anything or earning anything. This is about you learning to let go. To accept that you don't get to control whether I forgive you or when that happens or what our relationship looks like. He moved toward the door. I'll contact you when I'm ready. Maybe that's in 6 months. Maybe it's in 5 years. Maybe it's never. But it's on my timeline, not yours. And you need to accept that. Can you do that? Richard nodded, not trusting his voice. Yes, I can accept that. Daniel left, and Richard sat in the silence, feeling the weight of uncertainty. No timeline, no plan, no way to control the outcome. Just waiting, trusting that maybe someday his son would choose to let him back in. It was the hardest thing Richard had ever done. Not building an empire or making billions, but sitting with the consequences of his actions and accepting that he couldn't fix them through strategy or money or control. Months passed. Richard threw himself into therapy, doing the hard work of understanding why he'd done what he'd done. Why control felt safer than trust. Why he'd let his fear drive him to violate the people he loved most. He learned that grief, left unprocessed, doesn't just hurt, it warps. It had warped him into someone who believed love required management. That protection meant control. That trust was a weakness rather than a strength. Slowly, painfully, Richard began to change. Not performing change to impress Daniel or manipulate his way back into his son's life, but actually changing. Learning to sit with uncertainty. Learning to let go of outcomes. Learning that love meant trusting people to make their own choices, even when those choices terrified him. 6 months after their last conversation, Richard received a text from Daniel. Just a photo. Daniel and Sarah at what looked like a small, private ceremony. Sarah in a simple white dress. Daniel in a suit. Both of them smiling. Married. The text below read, "We got married yesterday. Just us and a few close friends. Wanted you to know. Not inviting you wasn't about punishing you. It was about protecting something precious. Hope you understand." Richard stared at the photo for hours. His son had gotten married without him there. He'd missed one of the most important moments of Daniel's life, and it was his own fault. Completely, utterly his own fault. But instead of anger or resentment or trying to manipulate his way back in, Richard felt something different. Acceptance. Daniel had made a choice, had set a boundary, had protected his relationship with Sarah by keeping Richard at a distance. And Richard had to respect that, had to let it be, had to trust that maybe, someday, if he continued doing the work of actually changing, there might be a path back. Richard texted back, "Congratulations. She looks beautiful. You both look happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. I understand why you didn't invite me. I respect that decision. I love you." The response came an hour later. "Thank you for understanding. Sarah says hi. We're working on forgiveness. It's slow, but we're trying." It wasn't reconciliation, but it was communication. And for now, that was enough. A year after the wedding, Richard received an unexpected call from Sarah. Not Daniel. Sarah. "Mr. Calloway?" "Sarah. Do you have time to talk?" Richard's heart raced. "Of course. Is everything okay? Is Daniel?" "Daniel's fine. We're both fine. Actually, we have news." She paused. "I'm pregnant. Due in 6 months." Richard felt joy and sorrow crash over him simultaneously. A grandchild. He was going to be a grandfather, and he might never get to meet his grandchild because of what he'd done. "That's wonderful news. Congratulations. You're going to be amazing parents." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Daniel and I have been talking about the baby, about family, about what we want our child's life to look like." She took a breath. "And we've decided we want you to be part of it. Not the way you were before, we can't go back to that. But in a new way, with clear boundaries, with honesty instead of manipulation, with trust instead of control." Richard couldn't speak. Sarah continued, "Daniel's not ready to call you yet. He's still processing, still healing. But he wanted me to tell you that when the baby comes, you'll be welcome to meet your grandchild, to be a grandfather. If you can prove that you've actually changed, that you understand boundaries, that you respect our autonomy as parents." Her voice became firmer. "But Richard, I need you to understand something. This is not forgiveness. This is not saying what you did was okay. This is us choosing to give you a chance because we believe people can change. But if you ever try to manipulate our lives again, if you try to control how we raise our child or make decisions for us or cross the boundaries we set, you're out. Permanently. No second chances. Do you understand?" Richard wiped tears from his face. "I understand. And I promise. I won't manipulate, won't control. I'll respect every boundary you set. I'll be grateful for whatever relationship you're willing to give me, and I won't push for more." Sarah seemed satisfied. "Good. We'll be in touch as we get closer to the due date. And Richard, thank you for telling us the truth when you did. It would have been easier to keep lying. The fact that you chose honesty, even though it cost you everything, is the only reason we're having this conversation." After she hung up, Richard sat in his study and let himself cry. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. He'd been given a chance he absolutely didn't deserve. A chance to be part of his grandchild's life. A chance to rebuild some kind of relationship with Daniel and Sarah. But it was a chance that came with conditions, with boundaries, with the clear understanding that he was being watched. That one wrong move would end this permanently. And that was exactly as it should be. 6 months later, Richard received a text at 3 in the morning. "Baby's here. Healthy girl. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Margaret Rose Calloway. We named her after your wife. When things settle, we'll arrange a visit." Richard stared at that text through tears. They'd named her Margaret, after his late wife, after Daniel's mother. It was a gesture of connection, of family, of forgiveness beginning to take root. 3 days later, Richard drove to the hospital with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He'd been given permission to visit for 30 minutes. Just 30 minutes to meet his granddaughter. He found Daniel and Sarah's room and knocked softly. Daniel answered, and for the first time in over a year, looked at Richard without anger in his eyes. Just exhaustion and cautious hope. "Come in." "But Dad, I need you to hear me. This is a gift. Sarah and I are giving you this opportunity. Don't make us regret it." Richard nodded. "I won't. I promise." Inside, Sarah was holding a tiny bundle wrapped in pink. She looked up at Richard and smiled, tired but genuine. "Would you like to hold your granddaughter?" Richard's hands were shaking as he carefully took the baby. She was so small, so perfect, so completely innocent of all the complicated history that had brought them to this moment. "Hello, Margaret Rose," Richard whispered. "I'm your grandfather, and I promise you, I'm going to be better for you than I was for your father. I'm going to respect your parents' choices. I'm going to trust instead of control. I'm going to love you without trying to manage you." He looked up at Daniel and Sarah. "Thank you for this chance, for trusting me with her. I know I don't deserve it." Daniel's expression was complicated. "You're right. You don't deserve it. But Sarah helped me understand something, that people deserve consequences for their actions. But they also deserve the possibility of redemption if they're willing to do the work." He moved closer, looking at his daughter in Richard's arms. "You told us the truth when you could have kept lying. You accepted our boundaries when you could have fought them. You respected our decision to get married without you when you could have tried to manipulate your way in. You've been in therapy for over a year, actually working on changing. That matters." Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "I'm not ready to call you Dad again. I don't know if I ever will be. But I'm willing to let you be Grandpa to Margaret. To see if you can be for her what you couldn't be for me. Someone who loves without controlling. Someone who trusts without testing. Someone who gives without manipulating." Richard held his granddaughter and felt the weight of this second chance. This gift he hadn't earned but was being given anyway because Sarah and Daniel were better people than he'd ever been. "I won't waste this," Richard said quietly. "I promise you both. I'll be the grandfather she deserves. And maybe, if I do this right, if I prove over years instead of weeks that I've actually changed, maybe someday you'll trust me to be your father again too." Daniel didn't respond to that, just took his daughter back and held her close, and Richard understood. Trust wasn't rebuilt through promises. It was rebuilt through consistent action over time, through proving day after day that you'd actually changed. He'd spent a year working on himself. It might take 10 more years to fully earn back Daniel's trust. And that was okay. That was fair. That was the consequence of his actions and the price of redemption. Richard stayed for his allotted 30 minutes, then left without pushing for more time, respecting boundaries even when he desperately wanted to stay. As he drove home, Richard thought about the journey that had brought him here. He'd started by trying to control his son's life, by manipulating and testing and engineering outcomes because he was too afraid to trust. And he'd almost lost everything because of it. But Sarah and Daniel had shown him grace, not immediate forgiveness, not pretending the harm hadn't happened, but the possibility of redemption if he was willing to do the actual work of changing. Over the next 2 years, Richard proved himself through small, consistent actions. He visited Margaret once a month, never more than he was invited, never pushing for additional time. He sent thoughtful gifts on birthdays and holidays, but nothing extravagant that would make Daniel and Sarah uncomfortable. He showed up when asked and stayed away when not. He went to therapy every week and did the hard work of understanding his control issues, his fear of vulnerability, his tendency to manipulate. He learned to sit with uncertainty, to let go of outcomes, to love without managing. Slowly, cautiously, Daniel began to soften. Phone calls became more frequent. Visits became less tense. Conversations moved from superficial to substantive. One evening, when Margaret was 2 years old, Daniel said something that made Richard's heart stop. They were sitting in Richard's study, the same room where Richard had confessed everything, where he'd almost lost his son forever. Margaret was playing on the floor with blocks, babbling to herself. "I've been thinking," Daniel said carefully, "about forgiveness, about what it means and whether I can actually do it." Richard waited, not daring to speak. "Sarah forgave you faster than I did. She said she understood fear and grief and how they make people do terrible things. She said you made a horrible choice but that you owned it and changed. That redemption should be possible." Daniel watched his daughter play. "I've been more stubborn, more angry, more unwilling to let go of what you did." He turned to Richard. But watching you with Margaret over the past 2 years has changed something for me. You're not the same person who manipulated my life. You respect our boundaries. You ask instead of assuming. You trust us to make our own parenting decisions even when you clearly have opinions. Richard felt tears welling up but stayed quiet. Daniel continued, and I realized something. I can either hold on to this anger forever, or I can choose to acknowledge that you've actually changed. That you've done the work. That you've proven over 2 years of consistent action that you're different. He met Richard's eyes. So I've decided to forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry this anger anymore. I don't want Margaret to grow up feeling the tension between us. I don't want my own fear of being controlled to stop me from having a relationship with my father. Richard's voice broke. Thank you. Daniel, thank you. I know I don't deserve. You're right, you don't deserve it. Daniel interrupted gently. But forgiveness isn't about what people deserve. It's about choosing to let go of hurt even when the hurt was real and valid. It's about deciding that people can change and that change should be honored. He smiled slightly. Besides, Sarah pointed out that if we believe in redemption for others, we have to believe in it for you too. Even when it's hard. Even when the hurt was personal. Margaret toddled over to Richard at that moment, holding up a block. Gampa! Look! Richard scooped her up, feeling the weight of this moment. His son had forgiven him, not erased what happened. Not pretended it didn't matter, but chosen to release the anger and move forward. It was more than Richard had hoped for, more than he'd imagined possible 2 years ago when everything had fallen apart. Over the next few years, Richard's relationship with Daniel gradually transformed into something new. Not the same as before, they could never go back to that, but something different, something built on honesty instead of assumption, on trust instead of control. On respect for boundaries instead of trampling them. When Margaret turned 4, Daniel asked Richard something unexpected. Sarah and I are planning a renewal of vows ceremony. 5 years since we got married. We want to do it right this time with family and friends. And we'd like you to be there. Not just as a guest. As my father. Richard felt overwhelming gratitude. I'd be honored. The ceremony was beautiful. Small and intimate in the same botanical garden where Daniel had originally planned to propose before Richard's confession had derailed everything. When it came time for family toasts, Daniel surprised everyone by calling Richard up. 5 years ago, Daniel began, addressing the gathered friends and family. My father did something terrible. He manipulated my life in ways I'm still processing. He violated boundaries and treated people like chess pieces. He caused real harm through his actions. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Richard felt exposed. But Daniel continued. But my father also did something brave. He told us the truth before it was too late to matter. He confessed when he could have kept lying. He accepted consequences when he could have tried to manipulate his way out of them. And over the past 3 years, he's done the actual work of changing. Not promising to change. Not intending to change. Actually changing through consistent action over time. Daniel looked at Richard. Redemption is real. People can change. My father proved that. And I want Margaret to grow up knowing that story. Not the sanitized version. The real version. The one where someone made terrible mistakes and then did the hard work of becoming someone different. He raised his glass. To my father, who taught me that it's never too late to choose integrity. That owning your mistakes is harder but better than hiding them. That love requires letting go of control. Thank you for finally learning what Mom tried to teach you all along. And thank you for not giving up when we needed space to heal. Richard couldn't speak through his tears. Daniel hugged him. A real hug, without the tension that had marked their interactions for years, and whispered, I love you, Dad. We're okay now. We're going to be okay. That evening, after the ceremony, Richard sat with Sarah while Daniel played with Margaret. Thank you, Richard said quietly, for giving me a chance when you had every right not to. For teaching Daniel about forgiveness when anger would have been easier. For letting me be part of Margaret's life. Sarah smiled. You earned it. Not through grand gestures or manipulation. but through small, consistent choices over years. That's what change looks like. That's what redemption requires. She paused. You know, I think about that morning outside Morrison's Market sometimes, when I bought you coffee and you asked me that question about love versus security. I had no idea who you were or what you were doing or how that conversation would change my life. Richard felt the guilt rise again. I'm sorry I tested you without your knowledge. Sorry I violated. I know you are, Sarah interrupted gently, and I've forgiven you for it. But I wanted to tell you something I've never said before. As horrible as what you did was, as much as it contaminated our story, it also taught me something important about Daniel. She looked over at her husband playing with their daughter. When Daniel found out what you did, he could have blamed me. Could have wondered if I was really genuine or if I'd somehow been in on it. Could have let your manipulation destroy our relationship. But he didn't. He chose to trust me. To believe our love was real even though the beginning was fake. To fight for us instead of letting your actions define us. Sarah met Richard's eyes. So, in a twisted way, your manipulation became the first real test of our relationship. And we passed. Not because of you, but despite you. We chose each other when it would have been easier to walk away. And that choice, that was ours. You couldn't orchestrate that or control that or manipulate that. Richard felt something shift. Sarah had just reframed the entire narrative. His manipulation had been wrong and harmful. But Sarah and Daniel had transformed it into something that strengthened rather than destroyed them. They'd taken the worst thing and used it to prove the best thing, that their love was real enough to survive betrayal. You're very wise, Richard said quietly. Daniel's lucky to have you. Margaret's lucky to have you as a mother. And I'm lucky that you chose to give me another chance. Sarah squeezed his hand briefly. We're all lucky, because we chose healing over bitterness. Growth over resentment. Possibility over punishment. That's what family means. Not that we don't hurt each other, but that we do the work to heal after the hurt. As the evening wore on and guests filtered away, Richard watched his son with his granddaughter. Watched the way Daniel was present with her. Playful, patient, not trying to control or manage or orchestrate, just loving her freely. Daniel was a better father than Richard had ever been, because Daniel had learned from Richard's mistakes instead of repeating them. Maybe that was the real redemption. Not that Richard had earned back his place in the family, but that his mistakes had taught Daniel to be different, to love without controlling, to trust without testing, to let people be free even when it terrified him. Margaret Rose toddled over to Richard as he was preparing to leave. Gampa, read story? She held up a picture book, looking at him with Eleanor's eyes and Daniel's smile, and a trust that Richard had done nothing to deserve but everything to earn. Richard looked at Daniel, asking permission. Daniel nodded. One story, but then it's bedtime. Richard sat in the chair by the window and let Margaret climb into his lap. As he read about caterpillars becoming butterflies, about transformation and change and becoming something new, Richard felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He'd made terrible mistakes, had violated people he loved, had almost destroyed everything that mattered. But he'd told the truth when it counted, had accepted consequences without fighting them, had done the actual work of changing over years of consistent effort. And he'd been given the gift of redemption, not because he deserved it, but because Sarah and Daniel were people who believed in second chances, who believed people could change, who believed that love meant holding space for growth even after betrayal. When Margaret fell asleep against his chest, Richard carefully handed her to Daniel. Thank you, he whispered, for letting me be part of this, for believing I could change, for not giving up on me. Daniel smiled. You're my dad. Even when I was furious with you, even when I needed space, you were still my dad. I just needed you to become the dad I needed instead of the dad who thought he knew better than everyone else. Richard drove home that night feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not triumph or satisfaction or the smug certainty of having orchestrated the perfect outcome, but something simpler. Gratitude, humility, the understanding that he didn't control anything except his own choices. and the profound relief of finally letting go. 7 years after he'd first disguised himself as a homeless man to test Sarah Mitchell, Richard sat in his study reflecting on everything that had happened. He'd tried to engineer the perfect life for his son, had manipulated and controlled and violated boundaries in the name of protection, had almost destroyed the relationships that mattered most. But Daniel and Sarah had survived his manipulation, had chosen love anyway, had built something real from the contaminated beginning he'd created. And they'd given him the gift of witnessing that love, of being part of it, not as the architect, as a guest, as someone allowed in through grace rather than entitlement. Richard pulled out his journal and wrote, "Today Margaret asked me why I live in such a big house all alone. I told her that I used to think control kept me safe, that managing outcomes protected me from pain, that I could engineer happiness for the people I loved. But I was wrong. Control didn't keep me safe, it isolated me. Managing outcomes didn't protect anyone. It violated them. And I couldn't engineer happiness. I could only create the conditions for it to be possible, and then trust people to choose it for themselves. Daniel and Sarah taught me that redemption is real, that people can change. But they also taught me that change is proven through years of consistent action, not through promises or intentions. That earning back trust means respecting boundaries even when you want to push them. That love requires letting go of outcomes and trusting people to make their own choices. I spent 72 years believing that strength meant control, that wisdom meant knowing better than everyone else, that love meant protecting people from their own mistakes. I was wrong about all of it. Real strength is vulnerability. Real wisdom is admitting what you don't know. Real love is trusting people to live their own lives, make their own choices, and experience their own consequences. Even when it terrifies you, especially when it terrifies you. Margaret will grow up knowing the full story, the manipulation, the betrayal, the consequence, the redemption, and maybe she'll learn earlier than I did that control and love are incompatible. That trust is a choice, not a conclusion. That the greatest gift we can give people is the freedom to be themselves. I can't undo what I did. Can't give Daniel and Sarah back their innocent beginning. But I've learned to live with that regret while still moving forward. To carry the weight of my mistakes without letting them crush me. To remember the harm I caused while still believing I can do better. If anyone reads this someday, maybe Margaret when she's older, maybe Daniel and Sarah if they want to understand, I want you to know, it's never too late. Change is possible at any age. Redemption is real if you're willing to do the work. And the work is everything. Not promising, not intending, but actually showing up differently, day after day, year after year, until the new patterns become who you are. I wasted decades being controlled by fear. Don't make my mistake. Learn earlier than I did that the things we do to protect ourselves often become the things that hurt us most. That walls meant to keep pain out also keep connection out. That control is a prison disguised as safety. Choose trust. Choose vulnerability. Choose love without conditions. It's terrifying. It's worth it. It's the only thing that actually matters. Richard closed his journal and looked at the photo on his desk. The renewal of vows ceremony. Daniel and Sarah and Margaret, all smiling, genuinely happy. And Richard in the background, not center stage but present. Included. Part of the family he'd almost lost forever. It wasn't the story he'd planned. The carefully orchestrated romance. The perfectly engineered relationship. The controlled outcome he'd tried to manufacture. It was better. Because it was real. Built on truth instead of manipulation. On trust instead of testing. On love that had survived betrayal and chosen forgiveness. Richard had tried to find his son a wife by pretending to be a poor beggar. He'd tested and observed and manipulated. He'd played God with people's lives. And he'd almost destroyed everything in the process. But what happened after might be the most important part of the story. Sarah and Daniel had survived his manipulation and built something real anyway. They'd chosen to forgive when anger would have been justified. They'd given Richard a chance at redemption when he deserved consequences. And they'd taught him that love requires letting go. That trust is a choice. that control is the opposite of care, that the greatest gift we can give people is the freedom to live their own lives, even when we're terrified they'll make mistakes. That was the real test, not whether Sarah would show kindness to a homeless man, but whether Richard could learn to love without controlling, whether he could trust without testing, whether he could let go of outcomes and embrace uncertainty. It had taken him 79 years to learn these lessons. But better late than never. Better to change at the end than to die still clinging to the patterns that had nearly destroyed everything worth having. As Richard turned off the lights in his study and headed to bed, he felt something he'd been chasing his whole life without knowing it. Not control. Not certainty. Not the satisfaction of having engineered the perfect outcome. But peace. Real peace. The kind that comes from finally accepting that you can't control everything. That trust is more powerful than testing. That love means letting go. His phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Just a photo. Margaret at her kindergarten graduation, holding a certificate and grinning with missing front teeth. The text below read, she asked if Gampa could come to her first day of real school next week. If you're free, we'd love to have you there. 8 a.m. pickup. Richard stared at that invitation for a long time. 7 years ago, he wouldn't have been invited to something like this. Wouldn't have been trusted to be part of the everyday moments that actually mattered. But he'd earned his way back through consistency, through respecting boundaries, through proving that he'd actually changed. He texted back, I'll be there. Thank you for including me. Then he set his phone down and let himself feel the full weight of this gift. He was being invited into his granddaughter's life. Not as the patriarch who controlled everything, but as Gampa, someone who showed up, someone who could be trusted, someone who'd learned, finally, that love meant supporting people's choices rather than making choices for them. The next week, Richard arrived at Daniel and Sarah's house at exactly 8 a.m. Not early, not trying to extend his time beyond what he'd been invited for, just respecting the boundary they'd set. Margaret ran to him immediately. Gampa, you came. I'm going to real school today. Richard scooped her up, marveling at how much she'd grown. I heard. Are you excited? Margaret nodded enthusiastically. A little scared. But Daddy says being scared and excited can happen together. Richard glanced at Daniel, who was watching this interaction carefully. Still protective. Still vigilant. Still making sure Richard wasn't crossing lines or trying to control. And that was fair. That was right. That was the consequence of Richard's actions, even 7 years later. Your daddy's very smart, Richard told Margaret. Being scared and excited together means you're doing something important. Something that matters. They drove to the school together, Daniel and Sarah in the front, Richard in the back with Margaret. A simple family moment that Richard had almost forfeited forever. At the school, Margaret held Richard's hand as they walked to her classroom. Will you come pick me up too, Gampa? She asked. Richard looked at Daniel, not answering without permission. Daniel smiled. If Gampa's available, I'm sure he'd love to, but we have to ask, not assume. Remember? Margaret nodded seriously. Gampa, are you available to pick me up today? It's okay if you're not. Richard felt his throat tighten. Daniel was teaching Margaret about consent, about asking instead of assuming, about respecting people's autonomy. All the lessons Richard had failed to learn until it was almost too late. I'm available, Richard said, and I'd be honored to pick you up. After they dropped Margaret off, Richard walked back to the car with Daniel and Sarah. Thank you, Richard said quietly, for letting me be part of this, for trusting me with her. Sarah smiled. You've earned that trust. Through 7 years of consistent action. That's what change looks like. Daniel added, you know what I realized recently? I'm not waiting for you to mess up anymore. I used to watch every interaction, waiting for you to slip back into old patterns. But you haven't. You've actually changed. He paused. That's rare, Dad. Most people promise to change but don't do the work. You did the work. And it shows. Richard felt emotion welling up. I had to. Losing you, losing the chance to be part of Margaret's life, that was unbearable. It was the wake-up call I needed. The consequence that finally broke through my defenses. They stood in the school parking lot, and Richard realized this was the first time in years that the conversation felt truly relaxed. Not tense. Not careful. Just real. "I'm proud of you both," Richard said. "Of the parents you are. Of the life you've built. Of how you taught me about forgiveness and redemption when you had every right to just cut me out forever." Sarah hugged him briefly. "Family's complicated, but it's worth fighting for. You taught us that, even if you taught it by showing us what not to do first." They laughed, and the laughter felt healing. That afternoon, Richard picked Margaret up from school as promised. She bounded out full of stories about her day, about new friends and the library and how big kid school was different from kindergarten. As Richard drove her home, listening to her chatter, he felt overwhelmingly grateful for this ordinary moment. This simple act of picking up his granddaughter from school. 7 years ago, he would have taken this for granted. Would have assumed it was his right as grandfather. Would have pushed for more time, more access, more control. Now he understood it was a privilege. A gift. Something earned through years of proving he could be trusted. When they arrived at the house, Margaret ran inside to tell her parents everything. Richard followed more slowly, and Daniel met him at the door. "Hey, Dad? Got a minute?" Richard's heart rate picked up. Had he done something wrong? Overstepped without realizing it? But Daniel's expression was calm. They walked into the study, that same room where so many important conversations had happened over the years. "Sarah and I have been talking," Daniel began, "about the future, about what we want for Margaret and for our family." He took a breath. "And we want to ask you something, but you can absolutely say no if it's too much." Richard waited, not daring to hope. "We're thinking about buying a house," Daniel continued. "A bigger place with a yard. Room for Margaret to grow up. And maybe for more kids eventually." He paused. "And we were thinking your estate has that guest house in the back. The one that's been empty for years. We were wondering if you'd be open to us renovating it. Making it our own. Living close to you but still separate. With clear boundaries." Richard felt tears prick his eyes. "You'd want to live near me?" Daniel nodded. "Not on top of you. Not without privacy. But close enough that Margaret could see you regularly. Close enough that we'd be nearby as you get older. Close enough to actually be family, not just people who visit sometimes." He met Richard's eyes. "But only if you can respect boundaries. Only if you understand this means we have our own space and our own lives and you don't get to just drop by whenever or have input on our parenting unless we ask. Can you do that?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Yes, absolutely yes. Whatever boundaries you need. I'll respect them all. I promise." Sarah appeared in the doorway. "We talked to our therapist about this. About whether it was healthy or if we were setting ourselves up for problems. She said it could work if everyone's clear about expectations and if you've proven, which you have, that you can maintain boundaries." She smiled. "And honestly, Richard, we've forgiven you. Really forgiven you. Not just said the words, but actually let go of the anger. You're not the same person who manipulated our lives 7 years ago. You're someone different. Someone we want Margaret to know. Someone we want in our lives. Fully in our lives." Richard couldn't speak for a moment. Then, quietly, "I don't deserve this." "You're right," Daniel said gently. "You don't deserve it. But that's not how love works. Love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing. And we're choosing to have you close. Because you've shown us that redemption is real. That people can change. That mistakes don't have to define you if you're willing to do the work to become someone different." Over the next 6 months, Daniel and Sarah renovated the guest house into a beautiful family home. Richard respected their process completely, offering help only when asked, staying out of decisions that weren't his to make, treating them as autonomous adults managing their own project. When they finally moved in, Richard hosted a small celebration. Nothing extravagant. He'd learned that grand gestures were often about him wanting to control rather than genuinely celebrating others. Just a simple dinner with close family and friends. During the dinner, Sarah stood up to say something. 7 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be living on Richard Calloway's estate, I would have laughed. Or cried. Probably both. The room chuckled. Because 7 years ago, I just learned that my entire relationship with Daniel had been orchestrated by a man who thought he knew better than we did what we needed. Sarah's expression grew serious. What Richard did was wrong. Unforgivably wrong. And I want to be clear about that, especially for Margaret's sake as she gets older and learns this story. You don't get to manipulate people's lives. You don't get to test them without their consent. You don't get to play God just because you're scared or because you think you're helping. She looked at Richard. But I also want to be clear about what happened after. Richard didn't make excuses. He didn't minimize what he'd done. He told us the truth when he could have kept lying. He accepted consequences without fighting them. And he spent 7 years doing the actual work of changing. Not performing change. Actually changing. Sarah raised her glass. To Richard, who taught us that redemption requires humility, consistency, and time. Who showed us that it's possible to transform even the worst mistakes into lessons that make us better. Who proved that it's never too late to choose differently. She smiled. And who's become the grandfather Margaret deserves. Welcome to the family. Again. Properly this time. Richard was crying openly now, and he didn't try to hide it. Thank you, all of you, for seeing me at my worst and still believing I could be better. For giving me chances I didn't deserve. For teaching me what love actually means. He looked at Margaret, who was watching the adults with curious eyes. Margaret, someday when you're older, your parents will tell you the full story of how they met. The good parts and the bad parts. The manipulation and the redemption. And I hope you'll learn from my mistakes. He paused. I hope you'll learn that control and love are opposites. That trust is more powerful than testing. That the greatest gift you can give people is the freedom to make their own choices, even when those choices scare you. I hope you'll learn these lessons at 7 instead of 77. Margaret nodded seriously, not fully understanding but sensing the importance of the moment. Okay, Gampa, I'll remember. The evening continued with laughter and stories, and Richard felt something he'd spent his whole life chasing without knowing it. He felt like he belonged. Not because he'd controlled or manipulated or engineered the perfect outcome, but because he'd been vulnerable enough to admit his mistakes, humble enough to accept consequences, and consistent enough to prove he'd actually changed. Days turned into months, turned into years. Richard's relationship with Daniel and Sarah deepened into something genuine, something built on honesty instead of manipulation, on trust instead of testing, on love that respected boundaries instead of trampling them. Margaret grew from a kindergartner into a thoughtful preteen. And true to their promise, Daniel and Sarah told her the full story when she turned 11. About how Gampa had pretended to be homeless to test her mother. About how he'd orchestrated their entire meeting. About how he'd almost destroyed everything through his manipulation. They didn't sugarcoat it. Didn't make Richard into a hero. Just told her the truth. Margaret processed the story quietly for several days. Then she asked to talk to Richard alone. They sat in his study, that room where so many important conversations had happened, and Margaret looked at him with Eleanor's eyes and her father's directness. Why did you do it? She asked. Why did you think you could control people like that? Richard had known this conversation would come eventually, had prepared for it with his therapist. But facing Margaret's honest confusion still hurt. Because I was afraid, Richard said simply. Your great-grandmother died when your dad was young, and I was so scared of losing him too, or seeing him get hurt, that I tried to control everything. I thought if I could just manage all the variables, I could prevent pain. He paused. But I was wrong. All I did was cause different pain. Worse pain. The kind that comes from violating people's trust and autonomy. Margaret thought about this. Did you love Mom when you tested her? Richard shook his head. I didn't know her. I was just looking for someone who met my criteria. Someone I thought would be good for your dad. That's weird, Margaret said bluntly. People aren't like job applicants. You can't just evaluate them and decide they're qualified for someone. Richard smiled despite the pain of this conversation. You're absolutely right. It was weird, and wrong, and dehumanizing. I treated your mother like she was a thing instead of a person with her own autonomy. But you changed, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. You did, right? Because Mom and Dad wouldn't let you live here if you were still like that. Richard nodded. I changed. It took years of therapy and hard work and learning to sit with discomfort instead of trying to control it. But yes, I changed. I'm not the same person who did those things. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm glad you changed. But I'm also glad Mom and Dad told me the truth. Some of my friends' parents pretend their families are perfect. But mine are honest about mistakes, about hard things, about how people can mess up and still be loved if they do the work to be better. She looked at Richard. Is that what redemption means? Richard felt his throat tighten. Yes, sweetheart. That's exactly what it means. Not pretending mistakes didn't happen, but doing the work to become someone different, and being loved through that process, even when you don't deserve it. Margaret hugged him. I love you, Gampa, even knowing what you did, because you're not that person anymore. Richard held his granddaughter and felt the full weight of Grace. He'd manipulated her parents' entire relationship, had violated their autonomy in fundamental ways, had almost destroyed everything, and somehow, impossibly, he'd been given this, a granddaughter who knew the worst thing about him and chose to love him anyway. Not because she was naive, but because Daniel and Sarah had taught her that people were complicated, that mistakes and growth could coexist, that love meant holding space for both the harm someone caused and the healing they'd done. Over the next few years, Richard watched Margaret grow into a remarkable young woman. She had Sarah's compassion and Daniel's directness and a wisdom that came from being raised by parents who believed in honesty over perfection. When Margaret was 15, she came to Richard with a request. I have to do a project for school about someone who changed their life, about redemption or transformation or whatever. Can I interview you? About what you did and how you changed? Richard's first instinct was to say no, to protect himself from the embarrassment of having his worst mistakes documented. But he recognized that instinct for what it was, the old Richard still trying to control outcomes. The new Richard understood that Margaret's education mattered more than his comfort. Yes, Richard said. You can ask me anything. I'll be completely honest. Over several interviews, Richard told Margaret everything. The fear that drove him to test Sarah. The manipulation involved in creating the volunteer program. The moment he realized he had to confess. The years of therapy and boundary respecting and proving he'd changed. Margaret recorded it all, asking thoughtful questions that showed she was really trying to understand. When she finished her project, a documentary-style video that she showed in her class, she asked if Richard wanted to watch it. Richard did. He sat in her room and watched his 15-year-old granddaughter narrate the story of his biggest mistake and subsequent redemption with nuance and insight that took his breath away. She didn't excuse what he'd done, but she also didn't define him by it. She showed the harm and the healing, the betrayal and the forgiveness, the manipulation and the years of making amends. At the end, Margaret appeared on screen and said something that made Richard cry. My Gampa made a terrible mistake, but he taught me something important, that you're not defined by your worst moment. You're defined by what you do after, by whether you own your mistakes or hide from them, by whether you do the work to change or just promise to change. Redemption is real, but it's not easy. It requires humility and consistency and time. Lots of time. My Gampa spent 7 years proving he'd changed before my parents fully trusted him. And he's been proving it every day since. I love my Gampa, not despite what he did but including what he did, because he's shown me that people are complicated, that mistakes and goodness can exist in the same person, that love means holding space for both, and that it's never, ever too late to choose to be better. The video ended, and Richard sat in silence for a moment. Then he hugged Margaret tightly. Thank you for seeing me so clearly, for understanding the complexity, for not letting my mistake be the only story, but also not erasing it from the story. Margaret hugged him back. You taught me that, by being honest about it, by not hiding from it, by letting me know the truth even though it made you uncomfortable. That's what real change looks like. Richard was 86 years old now. Daniel was 50 and Sarah was 45. Margaret was 17 and preparing for college. The years had been kind to them. The family that had almost been destroyed by Richard's manipulation had not only survived but thrived. One evening, Richard received an unexpected visit from Sarah. Just Sarah without Daniel or Margaret. She sat in his study, that room that had witnessed so much, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I have something to tell you," Sarah said. "Something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I wanted to say it before I lost the courage." Richard's heart raced. "What is it? Is everything okay?" Sarah smiled. "Everything's fine, better than fine. But I needed to tell you this. And it feels weird and uncomfortable, but also important." She took a breath. "I forgave you a long time ago, years ago. You know that. But what I've never said is," she paused, choosing words carefully, "is that in some strange, twisted way, I'm grateful. Not for what you did. What you did was terrible and violated my autonomy in ways I still occasionally get angry about. But for what came after." She leaned forward. "Your manipulation became the catalyst for me and Daniel to build the strongest relationship I've ever seen. Because we had to fight for it. We had to choose it when it would have been easier to walk away. We had to examine every aspect of our connection and decide what was real and what wasn't. And that examination made us stronger." Sarah's eyes were wet. "Most couples never have to do that work. They coast on the assumption that what they have is real without ever testing it. But we couldn't coast. We had to dig deep. Had to be brutally honest with each other. Had to choose trust when doubt would have been easier." She smiled. "So yeah, what you did was awful. But it gave us something we might not have found otherwise. A foundation we know is solid because we stress-tested it in ways most relationships never face. And for that, not for the manipulation, but for the unintended consequence of it, I'm grateful." Richard felt tears streaming down his face. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Sarah said. "I just wanted you to know that redemption is real, that transformation is possible, that your worst mistake ended up leading to something beautiful. Not because the mistake was good, but because we chose to transform it into something meaningful." She stood up to leave, then turned back. "And Richard, I tell this story sometimes, to friends going through hard things, to people who think their relationships are doomed because of betrayal or manipulation or lies. I tell them about us, about how we survived something that should have destroyed us, about how your confession and years of making amends taught us all about real redemption." She smiled. "So in a weird way, your story, our story, gives people hope. Shows them that even the worst betrayals can be survived if everyone's willing to do the work. That's your legacy, Richard. Not the manipulation, but the redemption. Not the testing, but the transformation." After Sarah left, Richard sat alone in his study for a long time. He thought about the man he'd been 14 years ago, the man who disguised himself as a homeless person to test his son's future wife, the man who'd manipulated and controlled and violated boundaries because he was too afraid to trust. That man was gone, transformed through years of hard work and consistent choice into someone different. Someone who understood that love meant letting go, that trust was more powerful than testing, that the greatest gift you could give people was the freedom to live their own lives. Richard picked up his journal and wrote one final entry. "Today Sarah told me she's grateful for what came after my manipulation. Not for the manipulation itself, but for how it forced her and Daniel to build something stronger than most relationships ever become. I don't know how to hold that. The idea that my worst mistake led to something beautiful. Not because the mistake was good, but because they transformed it. I think that's what redemption actually means. Not that the harm is erased or forgotten or made okay, but that people can choose to transform harm into growth. To take the worst thing and use it to build something better. To refuse to let mistakes define the entire story. I spent 86 years learning what Margaret understood at 15. That you're not defined by your worst moment. You're defined by what you do after. By whether you own your mistakes or hide from them. By whether you actually change or just promise to. I manipulated my son's entire relationship. I tested his future wife without her consent. I violated autonomy and trust and basic human dignity. I did terrible things because I was afraid, because I thought control was safety, because I didn't know how to love without managing. But I told the truth when I could have kept lying. I accepted consequences without fighting them. I spent 14 years proving I'd actually changed. I learned to love with open hands instead of closed fists. I became someone different. That's all any of us can do. Acknowledge our mistakes. Accept our consequences. Do the work to change. And trust that maybe, if we're consistent enough over enough years, we might be given the grace of redemption. To anyone reading this, probably Margaret someday, maybe Daniel and Sarah if they want to understand. Know this, it's never too late. Change is possible. Redemption is real. But only if you do the actual work. Only if you accept that transformation takes years, not weeks. Only if you prove yourself through consistent action rather than grand promises. Choose trust over control. Choose vulnerability over safety. Choose love without conditions. It's terrifying. It's worth it. It's the only thing that actually matters. Richard closed the journal and looked around his study. This room had witnessed his worst decision and his greatest redemption. Had held the conversations that destroyed and rebuilt his family. Had been the setting for confession and forgiveness and grace. Tomorrow, Margaret would come over to help him sort through old photos for a family album she was making. Daniel and Sarah were coming for dinner on Sunday. His life was full not because he'd controlled or manipulated or engineered outcomes, but because he'd finally learned to let go. The billionaire who'd pretended to be a poor beggar to find his son a wife had learned the hardest lesson of all. That you can't manufacture love. You can only trust it. That testing people without their consent is violation, not protection. That control is the opposite of care. And that redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the years of unglamorous, consistent work required to actually change. Richard turned off the lights in his study and headed to bed, feeling the peace that comes from finally accepting that you're exactly where you're meant to be. Not because you controlled the journey, but because you survived your own worst mistakes and came out the other side transformed. That was the real story, not about a test or a manipulation, but about what happens when people choose healing over bitterness, growth over resentment, forgiveness over punishment, love over control. That was the story worth telling. And Richard was finally, after 86 years, living it instead of trying to write it for everyone else. Before we close, we want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered that something in your life was orchestrated by someone else? Have you been manipulated with good intentions? How did you respond? And if you were in Sarah or Daniel's position, could you have forgiven? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter. Your experiences help others who might be going through similar situations. Let's build a community of people learning to love without controlling, to trust without testing, to give people the freedom to write their own stories. And if this story made you think about your own relationships, about the difference between love and control, about the possibility of redemption even after terrible mistakes, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week. Stories about real people making real mistakes and finding real redemption. Stories that remind us we're all capable of change if we're willing to do the work. Thank you for staying with us through this entire journey. Thank you for witnessing Richard's transformation, Sarah and Daniel's resilience, and Margaret's wisdom. Thank you for believing, like they did, that people can change. That redemption is real. That it's never too late to choose differently. Until next time, remember, the greatest test isn't whether others meet our standards. It's whether we can love people enough to let them be free. Choose freedom. Choose trust. Choose love without control. That's where real connection lives. That's where redemption happens. That's where family is built. Not on manipulation or testing or engineering outcomes, but on honesty, respect, and the courage to let people write their own stories while we cheer from the sidelines. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.